Hey everyone! Tonight we're exploring one of the most sobering aspects of medieval life, the justice systems that governed European kingdoms and the consequences that awaited those who broke the laws of their time. This isn't a journey into sensationalism or unnecessary detail, but rather a thoughtful examination of how medieval societies understood justice, maintained order, and dealt with those who violated community standards. Before we begin this exploration of a difficult but important historical topic, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if these deeper dives into history's complex realities resonate with you. Feel free to share in the comments where in the world everyone is watching from tonight. It's always wonderful to see this community span continents and time zones. Now, settle in comfortably, and let's explore together the medieval justice system with the understanding and perspective that historical distance provides, examining not just what happened, but why these societies operated as they did. When modern people think about medieval justice, they often imagine a dark and arbitrary system where consequences were determined by the whims of cruel rulers. The reality was far more complex and in many ways more interesting than popular imagination suggests. Medieval justice systems, while harsh by contemporary standards, operated according to their own internal logic, reflected the values and beliefs of their societies, and served functions that made sense within their cultural contexts. Understanding medieval penalties requires setting aside modern assumptions about justice, rehabilitation, and human rights, concepts that simply didn't exist in medieval thinking. Instead, these were societies that viewed wrongdoing through lenses of honour, social order, religious morality, and collective security. The consequences that awaited those who violated laws were designed not primarily to reform individuals, but to maintain social order, satisfy victims' demands for justice, demonstrate authority, and deter others from similar actions. The justice systems of medieval Europe varied significantly by region, time period, and social context. What was true in 12th century England might differ considerably from practices in 14th century France or 15th century Italy. Local customs, regional laws, and the personalities of individual rulers all influenced how justice was administered. However, certain common threads ran through most medieval European legal systems, creating patterns that help us understand this distant world. Perhaps most importantly for modern audiences to understand, medieval people genuinely believed their justice systems were fair, appropriate, and even merciful by the standards of their time. The penalties that seem extreme to us were, in their view, necessary responses to serious threats against social order, moral order, and divine order. To truly understand medieval justice, we must try to see it through medieval eyes while maintaining our own ethical framework as observers from a very different era. Before exploring specific consequences for wrongdoing, it's essential to understand how medieval justice systems actually functioned. These weren't arbitrary or chaotic systems, despite what popular culture sometimes suggests. They operated according to complex rules, procedures, and principles that medieval people understood and generally accepted as legitimate. The concept of law itself differed from modern understanding. Medieval Europeans recognized multiple overlapping legal systems that coexisted and sometimes competed. Royal law, administered by the king and his representatives, governed certain matters and applied to certain people. Church law, administered by ecclesiastical courts, handled religious matters and had jurisdiction over clergy. Local customary law, varying by region, and sometimes by individual manor or town, governed many aspects of daily life. This legal plurality meant that the same action might be judged differently depending on who committed it, where it occurred, and which legal system claimed jurisdiction. Royal justice expanded gradually over the medieval period, with kings slowly asserting authority over matters previously handled by local lords or church courts. This process wasn't smooth or uniform. It involved centuries of negotiation, conflict, and gradual centralisation. By the later Middle Ages, royal courts in countries like England and France had established significant authority, but local and ecclesiastical courts remained important throughout the medieval period. The investigative and trial procedures that determined guilt or innocence were quite different from modern practices. There were no police forces in the modern sense conducting investigations. Instead, communities were collectively responsible for bringing wrongdoers to justice. The hue and cry system required that witnesses to serious offences immediately raise an alarm, and all able-bodied men in the area were obligated to pursue suspects. Failure to respond to a hue and cry could itself result in penalties. Once someone was accused of wrongdoing, various methods existed for determining guilt. Trial by jury, which developed in England and spread to some other regions, involved groups of local people who often knew both the accused and the alleged victim. These early juries didn't hear evidence in the modern sense. They were expected to already know the facts, or to investigate and determine truth based on their knowledge of local affairs and the people involved. Other methods for determining guilt included compurgation, where the accused would swear to innocence and bring a specified number of oath helpers who would swear to believing the oath. This wasn't exactly character witnesses testifying to good behaviour. It was a quasi-magical procedure where the community's willingness to support someone with oaths was believed to reveal truth. If the accused couldn't find enough oath helpers, this suggested guilt, as it meant the community didn't trust this person enough to support them. Trial by ordeal represented another approach, used particularly in earlier medieval periods. Various forms existed, but all shared the principle that God would reveal truth through physical tests. A person might be required to carry a hot iron a certain distance, plunge their hand into boiling water, or consume blessed bread that would supposedly cause choking if the person was lying. After the test, injuries would be examined. Healing cleanly suggested innocence, while infection indicated guilt. Modern understanding recognises these as tests of physical resilience rather than divine judgment, but medieval people generally believed God actively participated in revealing truth through ordeals. The Church officially ended trial by ordeal in 1215, requiring the development of other judicial procedures. This contributed to the expansion of jury trials and the evolution of more evidence-based approaches to determining guilt, though the transition took considerable time and varied significantly by region. Once guilt was established, consequences had to be determined. The severity of penalties generally corresponded to the severity of offences, though the correspondence wasn't always what modern people would expect. Social status of both perpetrator and victim significantly influenced outcomes. An offence against a noble by a peasant was treated far more seriously than the reverse. Harm done to clergy received particularly serious attention, as attacks on God's servants were considered attacks on divine order itself. The concept of intentionality, whether harm was deliberate or accidental, was recognised but understood differently than in modern law. Medieval justice focused heavily on outcomes rather than intentions. Someone who accidentally caused another's demise through carelessness might face serious consequences despite lacking malicious intent, because the harm to the victim and their family still demanded justice. Victims and their families played central roles in medieval justice that have no modern equivalent. For many offences, victims or their relatives were expected to bring accusations and pursue justice. This private prosecution system meant that wealth and social connections significantly influenced whether wrongdoers faced consequences. A poor victim might lack resources to pursue justice against a wealthy offender, while a wealthy victim could mobilise legal systems effectively against even relatively minor offences. Financial compensation to victims or their families was a central feature of many medieval justice systems, particularly for offences that didn't threaten social order catastrophically. Detailed schedules existed specifying compensation for various injuries. So much for a lost eye, different amounts for fingers depending on which ones, specific sums for various types of wounds. This Wergild system, the term varied by region, attempted to translate harm into monetary terms that could satisfy victims while allowing offenders to make amends without suffering physical penalties. This compensation system reflected practical recognition that simply removing offenders from society didn't help victims or their families, who might face economic hardship as a result of harm done to them. Financial restitution provided concrete assistance while also satisfying honour and the desire for justice. However, compensation was only available to those who could pay. Those without means faced physical or other penalties instead. Medieval justice recognised a broad spectrum of consequences for wrongdoing, ranging from relatively minor penalties for small infractions to the most severe responses for crimes considered threats to social, moral, or divine order. Understanding this hierarchy helps contextualise why certain penalties existed and how they functioned within medieval society. At the least severe end were penalties designed to cause shame, embarrassment, or social stigma without permanent physical harm. These public humiliation penalties served important functions in communities where reputation and honour were valuable social currencies. Being publicly identified as a wrongdoer, even for minor offences, carried significant consequences in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. The stocks and pillory represented common implements for public shaming. Offenders would be secured in these devices in central locations, market squares, church grounds, or town centres, where they would remain for specified periods while community members observed, commented, and sometimes threw soft refuse. This wasn't designed to cause physical injury, though the discomfort of remaining in fixed positions for hours was genuine, but rather to mark the person as someone who had violated community standards. The offences that led to time in stocks or pillory varied, but often involved economic dishonesty, merchants who cheated customers with false weights, bakers who sold underweight bread, brewers who produced substandard ale. The public nature of the penalty served multiple purposes. It identified dishonest traders to the community, satisfied customers who had been cheated, demonstrated that authorities were addressing misconduct, and discouraged others from similar behaviour. Ducking stools represented another shaming device, used particularly for offences related to gossip, slander, or disturbing community peace. Offences often associated with women in medieval societies that had gendered expectations about behaviour. The ducking stool was a chair on a long wooden arm that could pivot, allowing the secured person to be dunked into water. This was uncomfortable and humiliating, but not intended to cause lasting harm, serving primarily to embarrass the offender and mark them publicly as someone who had violated behavioural norms. Branding represented a more permanent form of marking, literally burning identifying marks onto offenders' bodies, typically on visible areas like the hand or forehead. This identified the person as a lawbreaker permanently, carrying social consequences that extended far beyond the initial penalty. Branded individuals faced ongoing stigma, difficulty finding work or housing, and general social exclusion. The practice was used for repeat offenders or those whose crimes warranted permanent identification, but not more severe consequences. Mutilation penalties, while they sound extreme to modern ears, were understood in medieval contexts as alternatives to the ultimate penalty. Removing a hand or finger, blinding, or other forms of deliberate injury served multiple purposes. They physically prevented certain future offences. A thief without hands cannot steal as easily. They marked the offender permanently, and they were believed to be proportional responses to serious wrongdoing. These penalties were reserved for significant offences, but were seen as measured alternatives that allowed the offender to continue living, albeit with permanent physical consequences. Imprisonment, interestingly, was not generally used as a primary form of penalty in medieval Europe. Prisons existed, but they were mainly holding facilities where accused persons awaited trial or where convicted persons awaited other consequences. The idea of incarceration itself as rehabilitation didn't exist in medieval thinking. Keeping someone imprisoned long-term was expensive, requiring feeding and guarding them, and medieval authorities generally preferred penalties that either generated revenue, fines and compensation, removed problems permanently, or at least didn't create ongoing costs. Exceptions existed. Some fortified towers and dungeons held important prisoners whose status or political value made their continued detention worthwhile. Debtors might be held until they or their families arranged payment. But the prison sentence as a standard criminal penalty was largely a later development that became common only in early modern and modern periods. Banishment and exile represented another category of consequence that removed problematic individuals from communities without the finality or expense of other options. A person banished from a town, region or kingdom had to leave, and was prohibited from returning under threat of more severe penalties if they violated the exile. This solved the immediate problem of dealing with the offender, while also avoiding the costs of imprisonment or the irreversibility of capital penalties. Outlawry was a related but more severe status. Someone declared an outlaw was literally placed outside the protection of law. They could be harmed or even ended by anyone without legal consequence to the attacker. This essentially made the outlaw hunted prey, forcing them to flee to remote areas or seek refuge in places beyond the jurisdiction that had declared them outlaw. Outlawry was used for serious offences or for those who fled rather than facing justice, creating legal justification for their capture or removal. Economic penalties range from small fines for minor infractions to complete confiscation of property for serious offences. These penalties served multiple purposes. They generated revenue for authorities, they compensated victims when structured as restitution, and they caused real hardship to offenders without physical harm. For wealthy offenders, substantial fines might be the primary or only consequence for offences that would result in physical penalties for poor perpetrators. This class-based disparity was openly acknowledged. It was simply accepted that people of different social stations would face different consequences. The most severe category included penalties that permanently removed offenders from society. These irreversible consequences were reserved for offences considered most serious: treason, certain types of harming others, persistent theft despite previous penalties, some moral offences, and similar crimes that were viewed as fundamental threats to social order or divine law. The methods varied by region, time period, and the specific nature of the offence, but the principle was similar. Certain wrongdoing was considered so serious that the perpetrator could not be allowed to remain in the community. Medieval justice was deeply intertwined with religious belief and ecclesiastical authority. This wasn't incidental. It was fundamental to how medieval people understood law, morality, and the purposes of consequences for wrongdoing. The Church influenced medieval justice systems in profound ways that shaped both procedures and penalties. The Church claimed and generally received jurisdiction over clergy members accused of wrongdoing. The principle of benefit of clergy meant that priests, monks, and others in religious orders were tried in ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. This created a parallel justice system with its own procedures and penalties that often differed significantly from secular justice. Ecclesiastical courts couldn't impose penalties involving bloodshed according to church law, which limited their options but also led to creative alternatives. The distinction between ecclesiastical and secular jurisdiction created complications and sometimes conflicts. Who had authority over which offences and which offenders was often disputed. Over time, some compromises developed. Serious offences by clergy members might result in the Church removing the person from clerical status, after which they could face secular justice. But the existence of two separate systems created opportunities for manipulation, and meant that identical offences might face very different consequences depending on who committed them. The Church also influenced secular justice through moral teaching and social pressure. Religious authorities preached about justice, mercy, and proportionality, sometimes urging restraint in penalties. Conversely, they also advocated for harsh treatment of offences they viewed as particularly serious threats to Christian society. Heresy, blasphemy, certain moral offences, where religious and secular authorities often cooperated to punish those deemed dangerous to spiritual order. Sanctuary represented one of the most interesting intersections of religious and secular justice. Churches offered sanctuary to accused persons who reached church grounds before being captured. Once in sanctuary, the person was under church protection, and secular authorities could not simply extract them. This created a refuge that gave accused persons time to negotiate, possibly arrange compensation with victims, or in some cases agree to voluntary exile rather than facing trial and possible severe consequences. The sanctuary system reflected medieval belief in the sacred nature of church spaces and the Church's role as mediator and advocate for mercy. However, it also created practical problems when dangerous individuals used sanctuary to avoid justice. Over time, limitations developed. Sanctuary could be claimed for only certain offences, could last only limited periods, and eventually became more restricted until it was largely eliminated in early modern periods. Religious concepts shaped penalties directly. The idea of penance, performing acts to atone for sins, influenced how consequences were structured. Pilgrimages to holy sites were sometimes assigned as penalties, particularly for offences with religious dimensions. These served multiple purposes. They removed the offender from the community temporarily, they imposed hardship through difficult travel, and they theoretically provided opportunity for spiritual reflection and reform. The concept of proportional justice, that consequences should fit the offence, had both secular and religious dimensions. Biblical principles of proportionate justice influenced medieval thinking, though interpretations varied. Some used scriptures to argue for measured responses that didn't exceed the harm done. Others cited different passages to justify harsh penalties for offences that violated divine law. Excommunication represented the Church's most powerful penalty, excluding individuals from the Christian community and denying them access to sacraments. In medieval society, where religious participation was central to social identity and eternal salvation, excommunication was genuinely terrifying. An excommunicated person faced not just spiritual consequences, but also social isolation, as community members were supposed to avoid interaction with excommunicates. For serious offences, excommunication could be combined with secular penalties, creating both earthly and spiritual consequences. Conversely, some individuals who face severe secular penalties might receive religious counselling and sacraments before penalties were carried out, reflecting belief that even those who committed serious offences deserved opportunities for spiritual reconciliation. The Inquisition represented an extreme form of religious secular cooperation in pursuing those accused of heresy, holding beliefs contrary to church teachings. While the Inquisition is often simplified or sensationalized in popular culture, the historical reality was complex. Inquisitorial courts used specific procedures, kept detailed records, and actually had rules designed to prevent some forms of abuse, though by modern standards their methods were highly problematic. The penalties that inquisitorial courts recommended range from penance and pilgrimage through confiscation of property to, in cases of persistent or serious heresy, turning convicted heretics over to secular authorities for the ultimate penalty. The religious dimension of medieval justice meant that offenders were understood not just as violators of human law, but potentially as sinners against divine order. This raised the stakes considerably. Consequences weren't just about maintaining earthly order, but about protecting spiritual well-being and enforcing God's commands. This theological framework made certain penalties seem not just justified, but morally necessary from medieval perspectives. However, religious influence also introduced elements of mercy and restraint. Church teaching about forgiveness, redemption, and the value of souls created pressures toward mercy that sometimes moderated secular impulses toward harsh penalties. Religious figures often advocated for condemned individuals, arguing for reduced penalties or commutation. The tension between justice and mercy that runs through Christian theology played out in medieval justice systems in complex ways that resist simple characterization. One of the most striking features of medieval justice systems, at least to modern sensibilities, was their fundamentally public nature. Justice wasn't conducted behind closed doors in sterile courtrooms and prison facilities. It happened in public spaces, before community audiences, with transparency that served important social and political functions. Trials themselves were often public events. Community members could attend, observe proceedings, and witness how justice was administered. This transparency served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that authority figures were indeed addressing wrongdoing rather than ignoring it. It allowed communities to see that procedures were followed, and it created opportunities for public participation through testimony or oath-helping. The public nature of trials also meant that proceedings became community events, sometimes almost theatrical. Important trials drew crowds, generated discussion, and created shared experiences that reinforced community bonds. People would talk about trials, debate guilt or innocence, and discuss whether outcomes were just. This public discourse was an important part of how medieval societies processed and understood justice. When guilt was established and penalties imposed, the consequences often played out in public view as well. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty. It reflected deliberate choices about the purposes that penalties should serve. Public spectacle achieved several goals that private penalties could not. First, public penalties demonstrated that justice had been done. Victims, their families, and the broader community could witness consequences being imposed, satisfying their desire for justice and closing the matter publicly. This public acknowledgement of harm and imposition of consequences provided a form of closure that private penalties couldn't offer. Second, public penalties served deterrent functions. Witnessing someone facing consequences for wrongdoing was supposed to discourage others from similar behaviour. The logic was straightforward. If you see what happens to thieves, you'll think twice before stealing. Whether this deterrent effect actually worked is debatable. Scholars argue about this even regarding modern penalties. But medieval authorities genuinely believed that public examples discouraged wrongdoing. Third, Public penalties reaffirmed authority and social order. When rulers or their representatives publicly imposed consequences, they demonstrated their power and their commitment to maintaining order. This was particularly important in societies where central authority was often weak and challenged. Public demonstrations of justice reinforced the message that authority existed and would act against wrongdoers. The locations chosen for public penalties were significant. Market squares, major crossroads, city gates, and church grounds were all common venues. These were places where people naturally gathered, ensuring good audiences. The choice of location sometimes reflected the nature of the offence. Economic crimes might be punished in market squares, moral offences near churches, and so forth. The timing of public penalties also mattered. Market days, when crowds gathered, were popular times for imposing penalties. Religious festivals or other occasions when communities assembled provided opportunities for maximum witnessing. The scheduling wasn't random. Authorities deliberately chose times when they could ensure substantial audiences. For lesser penalties like time in stocks or pillory, the public nature was central to the purpose. Without audience to witness the humiliation, these penalties lost much of their effectiveness. The community's witnessing, commenting, and sometimes active participation, throwing soft objects, verbal harassment, was the actual penalty, far more than the physical discomfort of the restraining device itself. For more serious penalties, public witnessing served slightly different functions but remained important. Crowds would gather for executions, sometimes numbering in the thousands for particularly notable cases. These weren't necessarily bloodthirsty mobs, though crowd behaviour certainly varied, but rather communities participating in a significant civic and moral event. The atmosphere at public executions was complex. Contemporary accounts describe elements of carnival, with vendors selling food and drink, children present, and sometimes almost festive moods. But this coexisted with genuine religious seriousness. Prayers were said, clergy were present to provide spiritual counsel, and at least some spectators understood they were witnessing an important moral lesson about the consequences of wrongdoing. Offenders themselves sometimes participated in the public theatre of their penalties. Speeches from scaffolds or other penalty sites were common, where the condemned person might confess, express remorse, warn others against similar paths, or maintain innocence. These speeches contributed to the public spectacle, and were carefully observed by authorities who wanted offenders to play appropriate roles in the moral drama. Not everyone approved of the public spectacle of justice. Some religious figures expressed discomfort with the sometimes carnival atmosphere, arguing that serious moral matters shouldn't be treated as entertainment. Some scholars and thoughtful observers questioned whether public examples actually deterred wrongdoing or simply brutalized communities. But these dissenting voices were minority positions for most of the medieval period. The shift toward private justice, trials in courtrooms, penalties behind prison walls, limited public access, came mainly in later centuries as part of broader social changes. Medieval societies, for better or worse, believed that justice should be visible, public, and communal rather than private and hidden. This fundamental difference in approach created a justice system that was in many ways more transparent than modern systems, even while being far harsher in its actual penalties. Medieval economies depended heavily on trust, established practices, and communal regulation. Without modern consumer protection laws, quality standards, or regulatory agencies, communities relied on social pressure and justice systems to maintain honest dealing and protect against fraud. Economic offences therefore received considerable attention from medieval justice systems. Counterfeiting represented one of the most serious economic crimes because it threatened the entire monetary system. Producing false coins undermined trust in currency, damaged royal authority, as coins typically bore royal images and were royal prerogatives, and allowed counterfeiters to effectively steal from everyone who accepted false currency. Because of these far-reaching harms, counterfeiting typically received very harsh penalties, treated almost as seriously as treason. Theft was perhaps the most common economic offence and existed in many forms, each with its own typical consequences. Petty theft of items of small value might result in whipping, time in stocks, or small fines for first offences. Repeated theft escalated consequences significantly, as persistent thieves were seen as threats to social order who weren't deterred by lesser penalties. Grand larceny, Theft of items above a certain value threshold was treated far more seriously than petty theft. The value threshold varied by region and time period, but typically distinguished between stealing small amounts that, while wrong, didn't represent serious economic harm versus substantial theft that could ruin victims. Grand larceny often carried severe penalties because it represented both significant harm to victims and evidence of the thief's dangerous character. Livestock theft, particularly horses and cattle, received especially serious attention in agricultural societies where these animals represented major economic assets. A family's economic survival might depend on their livestock, so stealing these animals wasn't just theft, but potentially threatened the victims to support themselves. Horse theft in particular often carried severe penalties throughout medieval and into early modern periods. Burglary, theft from homes or other buildings, particularly at night, was treated more seriously than simple theft, because it combined theft with violation of the sanctity of homes and involved greater danger to victims. The nighttime breaking into someone's dwelling was understood to be terrifying and threatening beyond simple property loss, justifying harsher consequences than daytime theft of similar items. Highway robbery combined theft with violence or threat of violence, making it among the most serious economic offences. Robbers who attacked travellers threatened not just individuals, but the entire system of travel and commerce that societies depended upon. Safe roads were essential for trade, communication and social cohesion, so those who preyed on travellers faced severe penalties as both thieves and threats to public order. Fraud and commercial dishonesty received attention proportional to their economic impact and threat to communal trust. Merchants who used false weights or measures, who sold goods falsely represented, or who engaged in other deceptive practices faced various penalties designed to shame them publicly, compensate victims, and deter similar behaviour. The public nature of these penalties, time in pillory or stocks, having false weights destroyed publicly, being forced to display signs indicating their dishonesty, reflected the communal nature of medieval economic life. Bakers who sold underweight bread received particular attention because bread was a staple food that everyone depended upon, and customers typically couldn't easily verify the weight. Regulations specified bread prices and sizes, and bakers who cheated faced fines, time in pillory, or having their ovens sealed, preventing them from baking until they made restitution. The detail with which bread regulations were enforced might seem excessive, but reflected bread's central importance to medieval diets. Brewers faced similar scrutiny. Alewives who sold weak or contaminated ale, who charged excessive prices, or who used improper measures appeared frequently in manorial court records, facing fines and public shaming. The frequency of these cases suggests both that small-scale commercial fraud was common, and that communities and authorities took enforcement seriously. Usury, lending money at interest, occupied a complex position. Church teaching condemned usury as sinful exploitation, but economic reality required some form of credit for commerce to function. Jewish communities, not bound by Christian prohibitions against usury, often provided lending services, though this created resentment and contributed to anti-Jewish sentiment. Christian lenders found various ways to disguise interest, framing transactions as partnerships, penalties for late payment, or other structures that achieved similar economic results without technically charging interest. When usury was prosecuted, penalties ranged from fines and orders to return excess profits through confiscation of property and social stigma. However, enforcement was inconsistent, partly because authorities and even church officials sometimes needed to borrow money, creating conflicts between principle and practical needs. Debt was treated differently than simple theft, though failure to repay debts could lead to serious consequences. Debtors might face imprisonment until debts were paid, though this was obviously problematic since imprisoned persons couldn't work to earn money for repayment. Wealthy debtors might face property confiscation. Poor debtors sometimes entered into bonded service, working for creditors until debts were satisfied, a status uncomfortably close to temporary slavery. The treatment of economic offences reflected medieval society's understanding that commerce and property were fundamental to social order. Protecting honest trade, maintaining trust in economic transactions, and ensuring that theft didn't pay were seen as essential functions of justice systems. The penalties imposed on economic offenders served notice that societies wouldn't tolerate behaviour that threatened economic stability and trust. While economic offences received substantial attention, violence against persons was understood as even more serious, threatening not just property, but life, limb, and bodily integrity. Medieval justice systems devoted considerable effort to addressing interpersonal violence, while also recognising important distinctions between types of violence and circumstances under which it occurred. The most serious category of interpersonal violence was homicide, intentionally ending another person's life. This was universally condemned and typically carried the most severe penalties, though important qualifications and distinctions existed. Not all homicides were treated identically. Medieval law recognised differences between premeditated murder, killings in sudden quarrels, accidental deaths, and killings in self-defence or other justifiable circumstances. Premeditated murder, killing with planning and malice aforethought, received the harshest treatment. The deliberation involved made this particularly heinous in medieval thinking, showing a cold determination to destroy another person. Murderers who killed for profit, revenge, or other base motives faced the ultimate penalties, and their executions were sometimes conducted with particular formality to mark the seriousness of their crimes. Manslaughter, killing without premeditation, typically in the heat of passion or during sudden quarrels, was still extremely serious but distinguished from deliberate murder. Someone who killed another during a tavern brawl or domestic argument might face severe penalties, but possibly not quite as harsh as a calculated murderer. The distinction acknowledged that human passion and sudden anger, while not excuses, represented different moral situations than cold-blooded planning. Accidental homicide, causing death through negligence or misfortune without intent to harm, created complicated cases. Medieval justice recognised that accidents happened, but the victim was still deceased, and their family still demanded justice. Solutions varied, but often involved substantial compensation to the victim's family, combined with lesser physical penalties or penance. Some truly accidental killings might result in primarily religious penalties, pilgrimages, prayers, donations to churches, rather than severe secular consequences. Self-defence was recognised as justification for homicide in most medieval legal systems, though the burden of proof lay on the accused to demonstrate that they acted from genuine necessity rather than aggression. Someone who killed an attacker might avoid the most severe penalties, though they might still face requirements to provide compensation to the deceased's family or perform penance, reflecting the view that even justified killing involved taking a life and couldn't be entirely without consequence. The social status of both victim and perpetrator significantly influenced consequences for homicide. Killing a noble was treated far more seriously than killing a peasant. A noble who killed a peasant might face only fines or compensation requirements, while a peasant who killed a noble would face the harshest penalties. This inequality was openly acknowledged and accepted as reflecting the social hierarchy that medieval people believed was divinely ordained. Assault and battery, violence that injured but didn't eliminate, received serious attention proportional to the harm caused. Detailed injury tariffs existed, specifying compensation for various wounds, broken bones, lost teeth, damaged vision, and other injuries. These schedules attempted to translate physical harm into monetary terms, providing victims with compensation while allowing perpetrators to make amends without necessarily facing permanent physical penalties themselves. The severity of assault penalties often depended on whether the attack was planned or spontaneous, whether weapons were used, whether the victim was helpless, and various other circumstances. An ambush attack with weapons against an unarmed person would face harsher consequences than a fistfight where both parties willingly participated. Breaking into someone's home to assault them was worse than fighting in a public place. Attacking women, clergy, or other vulnerable persons received special condemnation. Maiming, deliberately causing permanent injury such as removing eyes, cutting off hands or feet or similar, was treated as especially heinous violence because it left victims permanently impaired. The consequences for maiming were often severe, sometimes involving equivalent injuries to the perpetrator, under principles of proportionate justice, though monetary compensation might substitute for wealthy offenders. Sexual violence was condemned, but the treatment of such cases revealed medieval societies' complicated attitudes about gender, honour, and consent. The status and reputation of victims influenced how seriously cases were treated. Violence against women of high status or good reputation, received more attention than similar violence against poor women or those considered morally questionable. This deeply problematic approach reflected medieval hierarchical thinking about status and honour, but meant that justice for victims was highly unequal. Domestic violence, violence within families, was partially hidden from justice systems by medieval family structures and beliefs about household authority. Husbands had considerable authority over wives, fathers over children, and masters over servants and apprentices. Violence within these relationships was often tolerated unless it became extreme, and even then intervention might come more from community pressure than formal justice systems. Wives who harmed husbands faced serious consequences as violations of proper hierarchy, while husbands who harmed wives faced lesser accountability. Violence related to honour disputes, duels, feuds, and challenges occupied an ambiguous position. Medieval culture highly valued honour, and men of the upper classes in particular were expected to defend their honour against slights. Formalised duels with agreed-upon rules were sometimes tolerated, or even legally recognised as ways to settle disputes. However, authorities also worried about violence spiralling out of control, leading to attempts to regulate or prohibit private violence, even while cultural values supported it. Blood feuds, cycles of revenge violence between families, were common in some regions and periods, particularly in earlier medieval centuries, and in regions with weak central authority. These feuds could continue for generations, with each act of violence prompting retaliation. Authorities tried various approaches to ending feuds, from imposing harsh penalties on participants to facilitating negotiated settlements involving compensation and oaths to cease hostilities. If violence against persons was serious, violence or even disloyalty against rulers and established authority was considered among the most heinous offences imaginable. Treason threatened not just individuals but the entire social and political order that medieval societies depended upon. Consequently, it received the harshest treatment and most elaborate penalties that justice systems could devise. High treason, acts against the king or sovereign, was the ultimate crime. This included not just actual violence against royalty, but also plotting such violence, aiding enemies, counterfeiting royal currency or seals, or in some formulations even expressing disloyal intentions. The breadth of what could constitute treason reflected rulers' understanding that their authority depended on loyalty, and that threats to their persons or power were threats to social order itself. The penalties for high treason were deliberately extreme, designed to exemplify the utter unacceptability of such betrayals. Traitors not only faced certain doom, but were often subjected to elaborate processes meant to maximise both suffering and public spectacle. The specifics varied by region and period, but the principle was consistent. Treason merited the most severe response possible, serving as an absolute deterrent and a demonstration of royal power. Drawing and quartering represented perhaps the most infamous penalty for high treason in England. The elaborate ritual involved multiple stages, each adding to both suffering and symbolic meaning. The process sent unmistakable messages about the consequences of betraying royal authority. This wasn't simple elimination of criminals, it was theatre designed to create such horror that no one would contemplate treason. Beyond the physical penalties, traitors typically faced attainder, legal penalties extending beyond their persons. Their property would be confiscated by the crown, their families might be disinherited or socially disgraced, and their very names might be condemned to ignominy. This extension of consequences beyond the individual reflected the view that treason was such a fundamental betrayal that it corrupted everything and everyone associated with the traitor. Petty treason was a related but distinct offence, involving betrayal of local authority rather than royal power. A wife who harmed her husband, a servant who harmed their master, or a clergyman who harmed their superior all committed forms of petty treason by violating the hierarchical relationships that structured medieval society. The penalties for petty treason were severe, though typically not as elaborate as for high treason, reflecting the somewhat lesser threat to social order. Rebellion and sedition, organising resistance against authority or encouraging others to resist, were treated as forms of treason, or as serious offences approaching treason. Leaders of rebellions, if captured, faced certain doom and often elaborate penalties. Followers might face lesser consequences depending on their level of involvement and whether they surrendered or were captured fighting. The consequences for rebellion reflected practical concerns as well as moral condemnation. Successful rebellions threatened everything that established authority depended upon. Even unsuccessful rebellions could destabilize regions, encourage further resistance, and demonstrate weakness in royal power. Therefore, rebellions had to be crushed decisively, and their leaders made examples of to discourage future risings. Heresy, holding religious beliefs contrary to church teachings, was treated as a form of treason against divine order, and, in societies where religious and political authority were intertwined, as having political dimensions as well. The Inquisition pursued heretics, using investigative procedures and penalties that reflected the seriousness with which religious deviation was viewed. Persistent heretics who refused to recant faced being turned over to secular authorities for the ultimate penalty, typically by burning, which avoided shedding blood, technically complying with church prohibition against clergy imposing bloody penalties, while still removing the heretic permanently. False accusation of treason was itself treated as an extremely serious offence. Given the severe consequences for treason, false accusations could destroy innocent people and undermine trust in justice systems. Those who falsely accused others of treason, if their deception was discovered, might face penalties similar to what their innocent victims would have suffered, a principle of equivalent consequences for attempting to wrongfully impose terrible penalties on others. Political crimes beyond treason, such as counterfeiting, mentioned earlier as both economic crime and against royal authority, unlicensed warfare between nobles, fortifying castles without permission, or other acts that challenged royal prerogatives, received serious attention proportional to the threat they posed to established order. Medieval kingship was often contested and weak, so acts that challenged royal authority had to be addressed firmly to maintain what power rulers did possess. Medieval justice systems weren't uniform across Europe. Significant variations existed between regions, kingdoms, time periods, and even individual jurisdictions. Understanding these variations helps avoid oversimplified generalizations about medieval justice, while revealing how local contexts shaped legal practices. England developed distinctive legal traditions, including common law systems and jury trials, that gradually spread to other regions. English justice evolved from Anglo-Saxon practices through Norman innovations following 1066, creating hybrid systems that combined multiple influences. The English crown gradually asserted greater authority over justice, developing royal courts that heard appeals and handled serious cases, while local courts managed lesser matters. English penalties reflected this evolving system. Hanging became the standard penalty for felonies, serious crimes, though numerous other penalties existed for lesser offences. The development of concepts like benefit of clergy, which eventually extended beyond actual clergy to anyone who could read, providing escape from capital penalties for first offences, created complexity and opportunities for mitigation that softened the harshest aspects of English justice. French justice systems were more fragmented for much of the medieval period, with considerable regional variation and competing jurisdictions. Royal justice expanded gradually from the Ile-de-France, but powerful nobles maintained their own courts, and customs varied significantly by region. Southern France, with its Roman law heritage, operated differently from northern customary law regions. The Holy Roman Empire, covering much of Central Europe, was even more jurisdictionally complex. Individual princes, bishops, and cities possessed substantial autonomy, creating a patchwork of different legal systems and practices. Some regions were quite progressive by medieval standards, while others maintained harsher customs. The empire's fragmentation meant that someone could face very different justice depending on exactly where an offence occurred. Italian city-states developed their own distinctive approaches, influenced by Roman law traditions and by their republican or oligarchic political structures. Italian justice could be quite sophisticated, with detailed legal codes, professional judges, and complex procedural rules. However, penalties could also be harsh, and political considerations often influenced justice in ways that favoured ruling families and their allies. Spanish kingdoms combined multiple influences, Visigothic, Roman, Islamic, and Christian traditions, creating distinctive legal systems. The Reconquista created frontier conditions where justice was often rough and immediate. The Spanish Inquisition, though primarily focused on religious orthodoxy, became a powerful force that extended beyond heresy to various other offences. creating a distinctive system that overlapped with but remained separate from secular justice. Scandinavian regions maintained strong traditions of customary law and local assemblies, things, where communities participated directly in judicial processes. Viking Age practices evolved into more structured medieval systems, but retained strong emphasis on compensation, arbitration, and community involvement. Scandinavian penalties could be harsh, but also frequently involved negotiated settlements that avoided the most extreme consequences. Eastern European kingdoms, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and others, developed their own legal traditions influenced by both Western practices and local customs. Some Eastern European legal codes were quite sophisticated, and these regions participated in the broader European legal culture while maintaining distinctive features. Temporal variations were as significant as geographical ones. Early medieval justice, roughly 500 to 1000 CE, differed substantially from high medieval, 1000 to 1300, and late medieval, 1300 to 1500 practices. The early period saw more violence, weaker central authority, more reliance on compensation and private settlement, and less standardized procedures. The high medieval period brought increased centralization, more formal legal systems, and greater royal authority over justice. The late medieval period saw continued evolution toward more proceduralized justice, with increasing roles for trained legal professionals. The gradual reception of Roman law, the process by which classical Roman legal texts were rediscovered, studied, and incorporated into medieval systems, influenced many European legal systems, though at different times and to different degrees. Roman law brought more sophisticated concepts of crime and punishment, more developed procedural rules, and trained legal professionals who could argue cases using learned legal principles. Local variations existed even within kingdoms and regions. A city might have different customs than surrounding countryside. A region on the border between kingdoms might blend influences from both sides. Areas with strong local lords might retain distinctive practices regardless of what royal or central authorities preferred. Medieval Europe's legal landscape was therefore immensely complex, with overlapping and sometimes competing systems that defy simple characterization. While medieval justice systems were harsh by modern standards, the seeds of eventual reform existed even within the medieval period. Critics, reformers, and thoughtful observers raised concerns about excessive cruelty, unequal application, and injustices inherent in medieval practices. The journey toward more humane justice was long and incomplete during the medieval period itself, but the process began earlier than many people realise. Some religious thinkers expressed discomfort with the severity and public spectacle of medieval penalties. Christian teachings about mercy, forgiveness, and redemption created tension with the harsh reality of medieval justice. Individual clergy members sometimes advocated for condemned prisoners, requesting clemency or arguing for reduced penalties. The sanctuary system represented institutionalized mercy, providing escapes for accused persons who might otherwise face harsh justice. Legal scholars and theorists, particularly in universities that developed during the High Medieval period, studied Roman law texts that contained more nuanced thinking about justice, proportionality, and the purposes of penalties. These scholars began developing more sophisticated frameworks for understanding crime and punishment, though translating theoretical improvements into actual practice was slow and difficult. Some rulers showed mercy or commuted sentences, though motivations were mixed. Royal pardons might reflect genuine mercy, political calculation showing magnanimity increased support, or simply recognition that particular penalties seemed excessive. Whatever the motivation, the exercise of clemency introduced flexibility into systems that might otherwise have operated with mechanical harshness. Economic considerations sometimes encouraged more measured approaches. Eliminating numerous offenders removed workers from the labour force and potential taxpayers from royal revenues. In some contexts, authorities concluded that lesser penalties, or especially monetary penalties and forced labour, served royal interests better than simply removing offenders permanently. This practical thinking sometimes moderated the harsh impulses that dominated theoretical justice. Trial procedures gradually improved, incorporating more safeguards and evidentiary standards. The development of jury systems, the increasing use of written records, the emergence of legal professionals who understood procedures and could argue for clients, all contributed to justice systems becoming somewhat more fair and less arbitrary. Convicted persons increasingly had opportunities to appeal decisions, though the appeals process was limited, and success far from guaranteed. The gradual limitation of trial by ordeal following its prohibition by the Church in 1215 represented significant reform. While ordeal seemed to offer divine judgment, in practice it was unreliable and often simply harmed innocent people. The move toward evidence-based determinations of guilt, however imperfect early attempts were, represented genuine improvement. Some regions developed more progressive approaches than others, creating models that eventually influenced broader practice. Italian city-states' more sophisticated legal systems, English common law developments, and various local innovations demonstrated that alternatives to the harshest practices existed. Knowledge of these alternatives spread slowly through Europe via scholars, travelling legal practitioners, and cultural exchange. The invention of printing in the mid-15th century accelerated the spread of legal knowledge and reform ideas. Legal texts, cases, and treatises could be reproduced and distributed more widely, allowing legal innovations in one place to influence thinking elsewhere. The standardization that printing enabled also contributed to reducing arbitrary local variations in favour of more consistent practices. The Renaissance and early modern period brought renewed interest in classical learning, including Roman legal thought that emphasized reason, proportion, and sophisticated analysis. Humanist scholars critiqued medieval practices from perspectives informed by classical examples, though these critiques bore fruit mainly in later centuries rather than within the medieval period itself. However, it's important not to overstate the pace or completeness of reform during the medieval period itself. For most of the Middle Ages, justice remained harsh, unequal, and often arbitrary. The reforms and mitigations that existed were limited and incomplete. The real transformation toward more humane justice came mainly in the 18th and 19th centuries with Enlightenment thinking, prison reform movements, and eventual abolition of the harshest penalties in most European nations. The medieval contribution to this eventual reform was more about planting seeds than harvesting crops. The questioning voices, the occasional merciful practices, the gradual procedural improvements, and the theoretical work of legal scholars created foundations that later reformers would build upon. Medieval justice was harsh, but within that harshness were glimmers of the more humane systems that would eventually develop. And so, as we step back from the courtrooms and public squares of medieval Europe, we're left with a complex picture of justice systems that reflected their times, while also disturbing our modern sensibilities. These weren't arbitrary systems of cruelty, as they're sometimes portrayed, but rather societies attempting to maintain order, protect communities, and enforce moral standards using the tools and thinking available to them. Yet the harshness of their methods and the inequalities built into their systems remain troubling even when understood in historical context. Medieval people genuinely believed their justice systems were appropriate and even necessary. They saw order and authority as fragile constructs that required dramatic enforcement to maintain. They understood consequences for wrongdoing as deterrence, as vengeance for victims, and as moral statements about right and wrong. The idea that justice should rehabilitate offenders, that penalties should be proportionate in ways we'd recognise, that all people deserved equal treatment regardless of status. These concepts simply didn't exist in medieval thinking. The public nature of medieval justice reflected societies where communal participation in all aspects of life was normal and expected. Privacy as a value had little place in medieval communities where everyone knew everyone else's business and collective judgment mattered more than individual feelings. Justice was public because life was public, and important social moments happened before audiences who could witness and remember. The harshness of medieval penalties reflected several factors: the absence of effective prisons for long-term incarceration, the need to respond to victims' demands for justice, the belief that dramatic examples would deter wrongdoing, the limited state capacity to manage offenders through less severe means, and fundamentally different understandings of human nature, social order, and appropriate responses to transgression. Understanding these historical systems serves several purposes for modern audiences. First, it provides perspective on how dramatically justice has evolved over centuries. The legal protections, procedural safeguards, and relatively humane penalties that modern democracies provide represent genuine progress achieved through long struggles and gradual reforms. This progress isn't inevitable or guaranteed. It must be maintained and defended. Second, studying medieval justice reveals how justice systems reflect the values and beliefs of their societies. Medieval Europeans believed in rigid social hierarchy, divine ordering of society, the reality of sin and evil, and the necessity of harsh discipline. Their justice systems reflected these beliefs. Modern justice systems similarly reflect contemporary values: rehabilitation, equality before law, proportionality, and human dignity. Understanding this connection helps us think more clearly about what values we want our justice systems to embody. Third, examining historical practices helps us avoid both uncritical presentism, judging the past entirely by modern standards, and romantic nostalgia, imagining the past as somehow better or simpler than today. Medieval justice was neither purely evil nor admirably straightforward. It was complex, reflected its context, served certain purposes, and had significant flaws. Seeing it clearly in all its complexity provides valuable perspective. The extreme penalties that existed in medieval European kingdoms represent a chapter in human history that we can learn from without repeating. The slow evolution toward more humane justice continues today, as societies grapple with questions about appropriate penalties, fairness in application, effectiveness of deterrence, and the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Medieval systems made choices that now seem wrong to us, but future generations may view some of our current practices with similar dismay. Perhaps most importantly, understanding medieval justice reminds us that legal systems are human creations, reflecting human assumptions and choices. They can be reformed, improved, and made more just through deliberate effort. The distance between medieval harshness and modern relative humanity was crossed through centuries of critique, reform, and gradual improvement. That journey continues as each generation works to create justice systems that better reflect our evolving understanding of fairness, dignity, and human worth. As the medieval courts recede into history, their legacy remains in the legal concepts, procedures, and institutions that evolved from them. Trial by jury, rules of evidence, the concept of proportionate penalties, the role of legal professionals, all have medieval roots, even as they've been transformed almost beyond recognition. Understanding where we came from, including the harsh realities of medieval justice, helps us appreciate how far we've come and illuminates the path toward where we still need to go. The extreme penalties of medieval kingdoms are, thankfully, mostly relegated to history, but the questions they raise about justice, order, mercy, and human dignity remain as relevant today as ever.